The needle went in wrong, and Elias Rhodes knew it the moment Azra Thunderroar hissed through her teeth. It was not a small sound. It was the kind of sound a woman made when she had endured a great deal already and was deciding, in that precise instant, whether to endure one more thing or simply end the source of her irritation. Elias froze. The lantern on the field surgeon's table swung gently from a rope strung between two tent poles, painting everything amber and shadow. And in that shifting light, the wound along Azra's ribs looked worse than it had 2 minutes ago when he had first pulled back her torn leather armor and seen what an enemy spear had done to her. "You are pulling the skin instead of drawing it together," she said. Her voice was low and controlled and carried the particular authority of someone who had been giving commands since before Elias could sharpen a blade. "Give me your hand." He hesitated, not from pride. He hesitated because he was a miller, not a surgeon, and the hands currently holding the bone needle and the wax thread were his own, and they were trembling slightly, and he was not ashamed of that, but he was aware of it. And aware, too, that the woman sitting upright on the surgeon's table with a 6-inch gash along her left ribs was the War Matron of the Thunderroar clan, and that approximately 40 of her warriors were camped 50 yards away on the other side of this tent wall. And that if he killed her with bad stitching, the treaty between her clan and the village of Crestfall would not survive the night. She reached up and closed her large green hand over his. Her fingers were calloused in the precise places that told you she had held a spear since childhood, and her grip was not rough. It was deliberate. She positioned his hand so that the needle was angled correctly, so that the thread would draw the wound closed rather than pucker it, and she did not move away. She stayed exactly where she was, her side warm against his knuckles, her breath steady and controlled while his was not. "Now," she said. He drew the stitch. She did not hiss this time. He did not look up at her face. He focused on the wound, on the next stitch, on doing it correctly, and she kept her hand over his and guided him stitch by stitch through the closing of a wound that would have left a scar no matter how well it was done. Her blood was bright against his fingers. The lantern swung. Outside, someone in the orc war camp was singing something low and rhythmic that sounded like a march slowed down to a lullaby, and the night smelled of pine smoke and the cold mountain air that came off the Greyveil range every evening when the sun went down. When the last stitch was tied, Elias sat back on his stool and became very aware that her hand was still on his. She looked down at it. Then she looked at him. Her eyes were dark gold, the color of autumn leaves a day before they fell, and they were currently doing something complicated that he did not have enough experience with orc women to read correctly. "You have done this before," she said, "but not enough." "I run a mill," he said, "grain in, flour out. The most surgical thing I do is adjust the millstone gap." The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood of one. "Then why are you here instead of the camp physician?" "Your warriors burned the camp physician's tent down this afternoon," Elias said. "Accidentally. And Surgeon Wren is 3 days' ride south on account of the border dispute at Thornwall. And you volunteered. No one else did." She looked at him for another moment. He could feel that look the way you felt a fire when you turned your back to it. Then she released his hand and reached for the strip of linen he had laid out for bandaging, and he took it from her because leaving her to bandage her own wound after all of that seemed wrong, and she let him, which seemed significant even if he could not have explained why. That was how it started, in the unsteady lantern light of the field surgeon's tent, on the 7th night of the fractious, exhausting, nearly failed peace negotiations between the Thunderroar clan and the village of Crestfall, with his hands still faintly stained with her blood and her guiding touch still warm on his knuckles. Elias Rhodes was 28 years old and had been running the mill at the edge of Crestfall for 4 years since his father died and left it to him. The mill sat on the Crest River where it narrowed between 2 limestone shelves, and the wheel was the heart of the village, the same way any working mill was the heart of any grain-growing settlement. Without it, the harvest sat in the granary and rotted. Without it, The winter flour ran short. Without the mill, Crestfall was just a collection of cold houses in the shadow of the Greyveil range with no particular reason to survive. He was an ordinary man in most of the ways that mattered. He was broad-shouldered from years of hauling sacks and maintaining machinery, and he had a mechanic's hands, rough and capable, and he was neither especially handsome nor especially ugly. He had brown hair that was always slightly dusty with flour and gray eyes that his mother, before she died when he was 12, had called the color of useful weather. He paid his taxes, kept the mill running through the bad winters when the river threatened to ice over, gave credit to farmers who were short on coin, and was, in the general consensus of Crestfall, a decent man. He was also, in the general consensus of Crestfall, profoundly alone. It was not something he talked about. It was just a thing that was true the way the distance between the mill and the nearest neighboring homestead was true. He worked, he slept, he ate at the tavern on evenings when the loneliness got loud enough to need company, and he went back to the mill. He had no family left. The woman who had briefly shown interest in marrying him 4 years ago had chosen a farmer instead on the grounds that farmers came home smelling like earth rather than millstone dust, and Elias had not blamed her. He had just quietly closed that door and focused on the wheel. The peace negotiations had arrived in his life like weather arrives. The Thunderroar clan had been pushing south out of the Greyveil range for 2 seasons, not raiding exactly, more like a slow encroachment. Their hunting bands ranging farther and farther into the valleys the human settlements considered their own, and the tension had built the way tension always built, until it was either going to break into blood or break into talking. The village council of Crestfall, to their credit, had chosen talking. They had sent a message north through a traitor who did business with both sides, and the message had come back with a time and a place, and the name of the War Matron who would come to speak. Azra Thunderroar. Elias had heard the name before the negotiations began. Most people in the border settlements had. She was 26 years old and had been leading the Thunderroar war band since she was 22, when the previous war chief had died of fever and left the clan to his only surviving daughter. She was said to be brilliant and brutal, and absolutely without patience for weakness. She was also said to be the most feared commander between the Greyveil Peaks and the Ironwater River, which meant that, when the village council had heard she was coming personally, 4 of the 7 members had quietly requested that they be permitted to send substitutes. They had all come anyway in the end, because Alderman Grieve had shamed them into it with a speech about the mill and the harvest, and what happened to Crestfall if the orc raiding parties decided to stop raiding and start something worse. Elias had not been invited to the negotiations at all. He had simply come, the same way he came to anything in Crestfall that he thought mattered, because the mill was downstream, and if anyone burned the valley, his wheel burned with it. He had been standing at the back of the meeting tent on that first day, flour still on his shirt from the morning's work, when Azra Thunderroar had walked in with her 4 senior warriors at her back, and the entire room had gone very still. She wore fitted warrior's leathers that moved with her like a second skin, dark brown, and tooled along the seams with the angular geometric markings of the Thunderroar clan, cinched at the waist with a wide belt from which hung a short-handled war axe and a bone-handled knife. The leather was cut close across her broad shoulders and her strong arms, and her dark hair was pulled back from her face in a series of tight braids wound with copper rings, leaving her features clear and striking. The strong jaw, the upswept tusks that curved maybe an inch above her lower lip, the dark gold eyes that swept the room in a single practiced assessment and missed nothing. She had looked at the aldermen. She had looked at the warriors who had come as guards. She had looked at Elias at the back of the tent, and he had had the distinct and somewhat uncomfortable impression that she had catalogued him as thoroughly as everyone else, and filed him in some internal ledger under a category he could not guess at. Then she had sat down across from Alderman Grieve, and the negotiations had begun. 6 days of negotiations had produced approximately the following results: a tentative agreement on hunting boundaries that neither side fully trusted, 3 near incidents when individual soldiers on both sides had started shoving each other, 1 actual brawl that had been broken up before anyone died, and the accidental burning of Surgeon Wren's field surgery tent by a Thunderroar warrior who had knocked over a brazier while attempting to demonstrate a point about territorial markers. On the 7th day, a border scout from a clan that was not the Thunderroar had apparently decided that the negotiations represented an opportunity and had put a spear in Azra Thunderroar's ribs while she was walking between the meeting tent and her war camp at dusk. She had pulled the spear out herself. That detail had gone through both camps like lightning. She had pulled it out and walked back to her tent under her own power, and the warrior she had sent back with the broken spear had delivered it to Alderman Greaves' table without a word, and everyone had understood what the message was. And then it had turned out that the only person available who could hold a needle and had any inclination to try was Elias Rhodes, who happened to have spent 3 years as a young man apprenticed briefly to a livestock surgeon before deciding that mills suited him better. So here he was, his hands still warm from her touch, the stitches straight and clean where she had guided him, the wound closed. He cleaned the needle and the thread and the surgical tools with the same methodical care he applied to everything, and she watched him do it from the table, and neither of them said anything for a while. "You are the miller," she said finally. "Yes. You were at the negotiations every day." "You do not sit on the council." "I don't." "Why come?" He thought about it. Not because he did not know the answer, but because he was the kind of person who wanted to give the accurate answer rather than the quick one. "The mill is the difference between Crestfall making it through the winter and not," he said. "Anything that threatens the valley threatens the mill. I thought I should understand what was being decided." She tilted her head slightly. "Most people who think like that run for council." "Most people who run for council want to make decisions," he said. "I just want the right decisions to be made. I don't care who makes them." The dark gold eyes did something again. Something he was starting to recognize as consideration, as if she were weighing something and finding it heavier than expected. "Elias Rhodes," she said. "Yes. You will come back tomorrow." It was not a question. He should probably have found that presumptuous. He found instead that he did not mind it at all. He came back the next morning to check the stitches, and found her already awake and working, seated at a low camp table covered in territory maps with 3 of her senior warriors surrounding her, and an argument in full swing about the hunting boundary language from the previous day's negotiations. She waved him toward a stool at the edge of the tent without breaking the argument, and he sat down and waited. He had not expected to find her interesting as well as striking, and yet he did. She argued the way a river moved, with absolute commitment to getting where it was going and a fluid intelligence that found every gap in the opposing position. She was completely unintimidated by her own senior warriors, which was remarkable because they were all formidably large people who had clearly been alive long enough to have opinions. She was also, he noticed, fair. When one of them made a point that was genuinely good, she acknowledged it without ego and adjusted her position, and when the argument resolved, she looked at him across the tent and said, "Now," and he came and checked the stitches. They were clean, no sign of festering. She had a constitution that made him feel that his own survival instincts were somewhat theoretical by comparison. "Good," he said. "I know," she said. He almost laughed. He did not quite. But she saw it, and the almost smile came back to her face, sharper than before. "Stay," she said. "We are discussing the hunting boundary. You know this valley better than anyone on the council." "I'm not a representative of the council," he said. "I am not asking the council," she said. "I am asking you." He stayed. He was there for 4 hours, and what he contributed was simple and practical. The location of every creek, every ridge, every seasonal game trail he had observed in 8 years of walking the valley edges at dawn, because he found that dawn walks helped him think. He had not known he knew so much about the land until he was asked to describe it, and Azra had listened with a quality of attention that he was not accustomed to, a complete and focused attention that made him feel, for the first time in a very long while, that what he said mattered. The boundary agreement that emerged from that session was the most concrete and workable thing produced in 7 days of negotiation. It was Alderman Grieve who noticed, when it was presented that afternoon, that the specific Creekand Ridgeline boundary matched the valley geography with a precision that had been missing from every previous draft, and who asked where the detail had come from. "The miller," Azra said. She said it in a tone that did not leave room for follow-up questions. 3 of the aldermen looked at Elias with expressions ranging from mild surprise to frank suspicion, and Alderman Grieve looked at him with what Elias could only describe as reassessment. He did not think about any of that much. He was thinking about the way she had said his name that morning, the weight she put on it, as if it were something worth holding carefully. The negotiations concluded the following day with a signed boundary agreement and an exchange of good faith tokens, a carved wooden seal from the village and a copper ring from Azra's own braids, presented formally to Alderman Grieve, while Azra looked at Grieve with the polite attention of a hawk watching something small and unthreatening move across an open field. The Thunderroar warriors began striking their camp in the afternoon. Elias went back to the mill. He had been there perhaps 2 hours, doing the kind of mindless mechanical work that was good for settling a busy head, when he heard a horse outside and went to the door and found Azra Thunderroar on a gray mountain horse that was shorter and stockier than lowland breeds, and built for exactly the kind of terrain the Greyveil range offered. She had changed nothing about her appearance except that the torn leather along her ribs had been laced back together with new cord, and he thought that was probably the most practical approach to armor repair he had ever seen. "You did not say goodbye," she said. He blinked. "I assumed you were leaving." "I am leaving," she said. "That is when one says goodbye." "I didn't know that applied," he said, which was honest. She looked at him from the horse, and then she looked at the mill, the wheel turning slowly in the gray afternoon light, the spray coming off the paddles in a fine mist that caught the low sun. "Is this all of it?" she said. "Most of it. There's a granary attached." "You run it alone?" "Mostly. I hire seasonal help for the heavy harvest months." She nodded slowly. Then she looked back at him. "The stitches will need to come out in 10 days. Can you reach the northern camp before then?" "I'm a miller," he said. "I don't generally travel to Orc War camps." "You would if I asked you," she said. It was not arrogant. It was simply stated with the same matter-of-fact confidence she brought to everything, and what made it impossible to argue with was that it was also true. He knew it was true the moment she said it. He did not know what to do with that knowledge. "I'll need someone to watch the mill," he said. The almost smile was all the way to a real smile now, brief and fierce and startling. 10 days, she said. "Follow the north trail past the second ridgeline. There will be a marker." She turned the horse and rode north, and the last he saw of her was the straight line of her back, and the copper rings in her braids catching the last of the afternoon sun. He arranged for his neighbor's eldest son, a reliable boy of 19 named Court, to mind the mill wheel for 2 days, left instructions precise enough to paper the wall with, and rode north on the 10th day. He found the marker, a strip of Thunderroar leather tied to a pine branch at a specific fork in the trail, amber and brown, knotted in a way that felt deliberate and particular. He had the strange sensation of being welcomed into something without quite having agreed to it yet, and he followed the trail as directed and came down into a valley he had never been in before, a broad rocky bowl sheltered by the peaks on 3 sides, where the Thunderroar camp spread across the valley floor in organized rows of hide tents around a central fire, large enough to house perhaps 300 people comfortably. The warriors at the perimeter looked at him. He looked back at them. He kept his hands visible and his pace even and said, in a voice he worked hard to keep level, "I am Elias Rhodes. I have come to remove the War Matron's stitches." There was a pause that lasted approximately 1 geological age. Then one of the perimeter guards jerked her head toward the camp interior, and he rode in. Azra's tent was larger than the others, differentiated by the carved pole at its entrance marked with the Thunderroar clan sign. He dismounted and tied the horse and ducked through the entrance and found her sitting cross-legged on a hide mat, surrounded by what appeared to be the entire administrative apparatus of running a clan of 300 people. Scrolls, ledgers made of hide, a set of carved weighing stones, 3 ceramic message seals, and 2 warriors who were clearly in the middle of a report. She looked up when he entered, and something in her face shifted in a way that was small and quick and not meant to be seen. He saw it. "Finish," she said to the warriors, and they did and left, and then she was pulling aside her laced armor and presenting him with the wound site the way she might present anyone with a professional task, matter of fact and unhurried. The stitches were beautifully healed. He had not expected any less from a woman with her constitution, but it was still satisfying to see his own careful work result in a clean scar rather than a festered disaster. He cleaned the site with the salve he had brought and cut each stitch with the small scissors from his kit and drew each one free, and she sat perfectly still through all of it, and they were close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating off her skin and smell the camp smoke in her hair. "No infection," he said. "Of course not." He smiled at the floor. "You could thank me." "I guided your hands," she said. "We did it together." "Fair point." He was putting away his kit when she said, "Stay tonight." He looked up. "There is a feast," she said. "We marked the agreement with the human settlement today. You should be there. You helped make the boundary." "I would be the only human in 300 orcs," he said. "Yes," she said simply, as if this were not a concern. He stayed. The feast was unlike anything he had experienced, which was not, he was discovering, a description that applied only to the feast. The Thunderroar clan cooked on massive flat stones over open fires, and the food was extraordinary, heavy with herbs he did not know and meat prepared in ways that bore no resemblance to anything he had eaten in Crestfall. He sat near the central fire, and people watched him with the cautious assessment that mirrored exactly what he imagined his own face had done when Azra walked into the meeting tent for the first time. And he ate what was put in front of him without hesitation, and did not stare at anyone, and gradually, over the course of 2 hours, the watching eased into something more like tolerance, and then into something more like curiosity. Azra sat across the fire from him for most of the evening, engaged in the social work of a clan leader at a feast, moving from conversation to conversation, presiding over small disputes, accepting tribute offerings, laughing once at something one of the senior warriors said, a real laugh, loud and brief and unself-conscious. He watched her and tried to look as though he was not watching her, and presumably failed, because at some point an older orc woman settled next to him, gray-braided and comfortable, and said without preamble, "She does not invite humans to feast." "I know," he said. "She does not invite anyone here that she does not consider worth something." "I know," he said again. The old woman looked at him with appraisal that had nothing to do with threat. "Can you ride?" she said. "Well enough. Can you fight?" "Poorly." "Honest," she said with something like approval. "What are you good at?" He thought about it. "Keeping things running," he said. "Finding what's broken and fixing it before it becomes worse." The old woman nodded slowly. "She is good at everything that moves," she said. "She has always needed someone good at what stays still." She got up and walked away before he could ask what that meant. He thought about it for most of the ride back to Crestfall the next morning. He thought about it for the 2 weeks after that, during which life returned to normal. The mill, the flour, the early autumn light on the water, the farmers bringing their grain. He thought about it when he adjusted the millstone gap, and when he logged the season's accounts, and when he ate alone at the tavern on Tuesday evenings, and listened to the other people talking to each other with the comfortable ease of people who had others to go home to. He was in the middle of a normal Tuesday evening at the tavern when the door opened, and a Thunderroar messenger came in, which was not a thing that had ever happened at the tavern before, and the room went the particular quality of silent that small settlements went when something unprecedented arrived. The messenger was young and brisk and said, with the directness of someone who had been sent with specific words to deliver, "The War Matron Azra Thunderroar requests that Elias Rhodes come to the northern camp for a meeting of importance." "What kind of meeting?" Elias said. "The kind that requires you to come," the messenger said. He went. He arrived at the camp the following morning and was taken directly to Azra's tent, where he found her standing at the center with her arms crossed and an expression that was the most unreadable thing he had seen on her face yet, which was saying something because she was generally not easy to read. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to understand that I am not asking lightly." He sat down, because he sensed this was a conversation that deserved steadiness. "All right. The Greyveil clans are pressing an alliance requirement," she said. "The Ironville clan to the east wants to merge territories. Their war chief has made it clear that the price of not merging is an escalating border conflict that would likely destroy the hunting grounds we both depend on." She paused. "He has also made it clear that the way to resolve the alliance requirement without a merger is for me to take a bond partner, a claiming in our custom. It makes the Thunderroar line stable and independent. It closes the argument." Elias was quiet for a moment. "And you are telling me this because—" "Because I am asking you," she said. The tent was very still. Outside, the camp sounds continued, ordinary and unhurried. "You could ask anyone," he said carefully. "Any orc warrior in the range, someone your clan knows." "I could," she said. "I am asking you. I am a miller. I know what you are. Why me?" She uncrossed her arms and moved to the entrance of the tent and looked out at the valley for a moment with her back to him. And when she spoke, her voice had dropped to something that was not quite private but was more honest than the formal register she typically used. "Because you came into my tent not knowing whether you would walk out again and you held a needle steady," she said. "Because you know this valley better than anyone, and you told me everything about it freely with no calculation. Because when I invited you to feast among 300 strangers you ate without flinching and looked at no one with contempt." She turned back. "Because the old healer sat with you and you made her laugh, which she has not done since my father died." He breathed. "That's not love," he said. "That's respect." "Yes," she said. "And that is where I start from. I'm not asking for something you do not have. I am asking for something we might build." He looked at her for a long time. She looked back, steady as a mountain, and he understood then that whatever he decided, she would not collapse from it, would not plead or manipulate or make it easier by pretending the risk was smaller than it was. She was simply standing there, magnificent and serious, and offering him something she had apparently decided he was worth offering. "There are conditions," he said. "Yes, I keep the mill running. I would not have it any other way. The boundary agreement depends on the valley's stability. I would live here in the camp, to start, until we know what we are building and where to build it. The village will have opinions." "Let them," she said, with the absolute disregard of someone for whom the opinions of Crestfall's aldermen were an extremely minor concern. He stood up. He crossed the tent to where she stood and looked up at her slightly because she had a few inches on him, and she looked down at him with those dark gold eyes that were currently doing the thing he had started to recognize as wanting, as genuinely wanting, and it hit him with a force that was almost physical that she had chosen him. Not a warrior, not a proven commander, him, the miller, the man who kept things running and ate alone on Tuesdays. "All right," he said. The claiming ceremony was performed 3 days later, in the center of the camp in front of the whole clan, which was as close to a wedding as Thunderroar custom produced. Azra's senior healer, the old gray-braided woman he had spoken with at the feast, whose name was Mara, presided over the ceremony with the efficiency of someone who had done this before and the warmth of someone who approved of this particular instance of it. The ceremony involved the exchange of a piece of each person's most important daily tool. Azra gave him the copper ring from her braid, the specific one she had taken back from the Crestfall Council after the treaty exchange, and he gave her the caliper he used to set the millstone gap, which was so specific and personal and so thoroughly him that he saw Mora press her lips together to hide something. They clasped wrists. Mora said words in the Thunderroar tongue that he did not fully understand, but the meaning of which was clear enough. These two, from this moment, accountable to each other. Then it was done. Azra looked at him in front of her entire clan with something open in her face that he had not seen there before, something that had been held in check by the formal context of negotiations and professional meetings, and now, in this specific moment, was allowed to show. He slid the copper ring onto his smallest finger because it fit there, and her eyes followed the gesture with an attention that made the back of his neck warm. He slept in her tent that night on his own bedroll on his own side, both of them fully dressed and lying in the dark and very much aware of the other, and neither of them said anything until she said quietly, "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone easier," she said. "Someone who needed more reassurance, someone I would have to manage." "Is that good or bad?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "Go to sleep." He did not sleep for a long time, but when he did he slept more deeply than he had in years, which told him something about himself that he was not entirely sure how to feel about. He rode back to Crestfall the next morning to tell Alderman Greyveil what had happened, and to check on the mill, and to begin the complicated practical business of living in two places at once. Alderman Greyveil's reaction was, in order: disbelief, silence, a long look at the copper ring on Elias' finger, and then something that was not quite approval but was at least not actively alarmed. "You understand this will complicate the treaty relationship," Greyveil said. "Or simplify it," Elias said. "Since I now have a direct line to the War Matron," another silence, "the council will want a meeting." "Schedule it," Elias said. "I'll be here." The village's reaction was, in order. Gossip, more gossip, a period of pointed staring whenever Elias came into the tavern, a confrontation from a man named Drek who ran the smithy and had strong opinions about the natural order of things, and then a gradual settling into the particular tolerance of a community that had decided the matter was not worth the energy to sustain outrage about. The confrontation with Drek happened in the road outside the mill on a market morning when 3 other farmers were within earshot. Drek was a large man and a loud one, and he positioned himself in the way of people who want an audience. "You've claimed an orc woman," he said, "as a bond partner." "Yes," Elias said. "You understand what people will say. They're already saying it." "You understand, Drek," Elias said, in a voice that was very quiet and very level. "I have run this mill for 4 years, and I have never once in those 4 years been unkind to you or yours. I have given your family credit when the harvest was short 3 years running. I intend to keep running this mill, and I intend to keep giving credit when it is needed, and I intend to keep doing whatever I have decided to do with my own life. If you have a genuine grievance, I will hear it. If you are here to perform an opinion for the benefit of an audience, I am going to ask you to step out of the road and let the market morning continue." The farmers within earshot were very quiet. Drek was quiet too for a long moment. Then he stepped aside and said nothing further, and Elias went back into the mill. He heard later that the same 3 farmers had each told that story in the tavern that evening, and that the version of it that circulated was more or less accurate, which was not always the case with stories that passed through Crestfall. He spent the next month in a rhythm that was new and uncomfortable, and also, underneath the discomfort, something else that he was only beginning to name. He rode north 3 or 4 days a week, and the rest of the time he was at the mill, and slowly the 2 parts of his life began to acquire a shared grammar. Azra came south twice, riding into Crestfall with the calm authority of someone who recognized no territory as hostile simply because it was foreign, and each time the village reacted, and each time the reaction settled faster than before. The dares started, as far as he could later identify the starting point, somewhere in the 3rd week. It was Azra who began it. She had come to the mill on a cold afternoon and found him adjusting a gear on the secondary axle, and she had stood watching him for a while and then said, with the particular tone that he was beginning to associate with her testing the water before stepping in, "I dare you to tell me one true thing about yourself that you have not told anyone." He had looked up at her from under the gear assembly. "That's a strange kind of dare." "I am a strange kind of person," she said. He thought about it seriously, which was how he approached everything. "I'm afraid of not being useful," he said finally. "Not of dying, not of pain, of becoming someone that nothing depends on." She had been quiet for a moment. Then she said, with a carefulness that told him this was a return, a reciprocation, "I'm afraid that the people who follow me will eventually see through what I project and find something smaller than what they need." They had looked at each other across the gear assembly in the dusty afternoon light. "Your turn," she said. "I used to talk to the mill wheel," he said. "When I first took over, when I was lonely and didn't know how to be the person my father had been. I used to argue with my father's maps," she said. "When he died and left me the clan, I told the maps they were wrong." "Were they?" "Often." "He was an excellent fighter and a mediocre cartographer." He laughed. A real one, full, that surprised him slightly. She watched it with the expression of someone who found a previously unknown door in a house they had thought they knew completely. The dares escalated from there, a game that was ostensibly about honesty, but was actually about the progressive lowering of every guard either of them had ever constructed. He dared her to spend a full day at the mill and do whatever he asked without complaint, and she did. And she turned out to be extraordinarily competent at mechanical maintenance, which was deeply unfair considering she was already extraordinarily competent at everything else. She dared him to attend a full Thunderroar Warrior Council meeting and offer an opinion, and he did. And he watched the senior warriors watch him with skepticism that slowly shifted to the same reassessment he had seen on Alderman Greaves' face. And he offered 3 opinions, 2 of which were accepted, and one of which started a 2-hour debate that eventually resolved in a direction that surprised him by being close to what he had suggested. He dared her to sit at the tavern in Crestfall for an evening without her war axe. She dared him to ride a Thunderroar mountain horse through the high pass above camp. He dared her to tell him something she found beautiful. She said the way water moved over stone at the first cold of autumn, and the way fire looked from a distance. And then she looked at him with the dark gold eyes and said, without looking away, that she found him beautiful. And the words sat in the air between them with the weight of something that had been true for a while and was only now being spoken. He crossed the tent to where she was sitting and crouched down in front of her so they were level, and he said, "Your turn to dare." "I dare you," she said, "to do what you are thinking about doing." He kissed her. She kissed back with the same committed intelligence she brought to everything, one large hand coming up to the side of his face, with a gentleness that was at direct odds with every story anyone in Crestfall had ever told about Azra Thunderroar. And the tent was warm, and the camp was quiet outside, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. When they broke apart, she was looking at him with something that was not the almost smile or the full smile, but something rarer and more fundamental, something that had no name except the name for what it was. "You are going to make this extremely complicated," she said. "Probably," he agreed. "I do not mind," she said. He stayed that night, and they talked until well past midnight about everything and nothing, his hands and her voice in the dark. And in the morning they were different in a way that was quiet and permanent, the way anything is different after it has been built into something real. The traitor arrived in their lives without announcing itself, the way traitors generally did. The first sign was small. The hunting boundary markers on the eastern line were moved. Not dramatically, just enough to create an apparent violation by the Thunderroar hunters, who were operating in good faith inside the agreed territory. The human farmers who worked the eastern valley edge reported the incursion, and Alderman Greaves sent Elias a message, and Elias rode south and stood in Greaves' office and said, "Show me exactly where the markers were and where they are now." The shift was precise and deliberate, and knew exactly which markers to move to create maximum tension with minimum evidence. Elias said nothing to Greyveil except that he would look into it. Then he rode north and told Azra. She was very still when he told her. The kind of still that preceded decision. Who knows the boundary well enough to move it accurately, she said. On the human side, 4 people, he said. Greyveil, the 2 border surveyors who set the original markers, and me. On your side. 6 of my senior warriors and my cartographer, she said. So it's either someone who was involved in setting the boundary, he said, or someone with access to the records of it. The second sign came 2 weeks later. A message went to the Irrevocably clan in Azra's name, or under a seal convincingly similar to hers, indicating that she was willing to discuss territorial merger terms. The Irrevocably war chief, a man named Greyveil who was said to be aggressive and not particularly careful about verification, had apparently taken this as an invitation and was now moving a warband south toward the Thunderroar range. Elias found out about the message not from Azra but from a traitor who came through Crestfall with news from the east, and he rode north immediately and found the camp in the organized, controlled tension of a warrior clan that was preparing for something it did not want to prepare for. "You knew," he said when he found Azra. "I knew last night," she said. "I was sending for you. Who has access to your seal?" "Mora, my senior cartographer, a man named Threll. And my second-in-command, Varro, who has been my second for 3 years. "Threll," he said, not a guess. He had been thinking about it the whole ride north. She looked at him. "Why?" "The boundary markers were moved with cartographic precision," he said. "Not a warrior's adjustment, not a rough approximation. The kind of precision that requires knowing exactly how the original survey was done. The only person who would know that with that level of accuracy is whoever made the original map of the boundary." "Threll made that map," she said. "And who does Threll owe allegiance to besides you?" The silence that followed that question was significant. Azra turned away from him and her hand went to the hilt of her axe in an involuntary gesture that she controlled immediately. "The Irrevocably have been offering coin to anyone who can destabilize the Thunderroar alliance structure," she said. "I knew that. I did not think it had reached inside the camp." "You trusted him," Elias said. "I did." "That is not a failure," he said. "It is what betrayal requires to function." She looked at him then with something that was complicated and grateful, and made him want to cross the tent to her, but this was not the moment for that. "We need to confirm it before we move," he said. "And we need to deal with Greyveil's warband before they arrive and make this worse. What is Greyveil's primary motivation?" "Territory and tribute," she said. "He is not ideological, he wants land and resources." "Then we give him a reason to want something else more," Elias said. She tilted her head. "Such as?" "The Human Valley settlements combined represent a significant trading partner," he said. "Stable grain supply, smithwork, salt trade from the coast. All of which the Irrevocably clan currently does not have access to and would benefit from." If Greyveil extended a direct trading offer to the Irrevocably contingent on their withdrawal from this action, it might be more valuable to Greyveil than whatever Threll promised him. "You would ask Greyveil to negotiate with Greyveil." "I would ask Greyveil to offer Greyveil a better deal than the one he's riding toward," Elias said. "Which is a fight he may or may not win against you, resulting in either significant losses or a destabilized Greyveil range that produces chaos for everyone." Azra was quiet for a long moment. "You are extraordinarily good at this," she said. "I set millstone gaps for a living," he said. "It is all about finding the right adjustment." The trap for Threll was set with the same precision that had been applied to the boundary markers. Azra planted a piece of false information through 3 different channels, each version subtly different, and waited to see which version reached Greyveil's advanced scouts. The version that arrived was the one that had passed through Threll. The confrontation happened in the camp's center on a clear, cold morning, in front of everyone, because Azra did not believe in conducting serious matters in private. She presented the evidence methodically, the specific variation in the false report that matched the version only Threll had received, the cartographic fingerprints on the boundary marker adjustments that matched his documented technique, and a witness, one of the junior scouts who had seen Threll meeting with an Ironville messenger 2 weeks prior and had not understood what she was seeing until now. Threll tried to deny it. He was a small man, compact and precise, with the focused intensity of a cartographer and the desperate eyes of someone who had miscalculated. He tried 3 different versions of the truth and none of them held, and finally he stood in the center of the assembled clan and was simply silent. "Why?" Azra said. Her voice was completely controlled. "The Ironville paid better," Threll said. "There was no complexity in it, no ideology, no principled objection, just money. The clan stripped his rank. They took his maps, which was the cartographer's version of being disarmed. They would exile him north, to the Greyveil passes, which was not a death sentence but was close to one in winter, until a formal judgment could be arranged through the clan tribunal. But what made it the moment everyone present would remember for years was what happened next. A second man stepped forward from the assembly. Elias had seen him before but not paid attention to him. A large orc warrior, branded on the forearm with the exile mark of a different clan, a burned scar in the shape of a horizontal bar that indicated a man who had been formally cast out. His name was Hurak, and he had arrived in the camp 6 months ago, claiming to be a traveling fighter seeking work, and Azra had taken him on as a general camp laborer because she was short on hands. Hurak said clearly and calmly into the silence that followed Threll's confession, "The Ironville also have an agreement with the human settlement's eastern tradesmen. He has been routing information about your treaty terms south to a Ironville agent in Crestfall's market quarter for the past 2 months. The crowd reacted. Azra's hand went to her axe. Elias said, very quietly, "Alderman Bain." Everyone looked at him. "Bain is the only alderman who voted against the treaty at the original council meeting," he said. "He owns the Eastern Trade Road and the toll gates on it. The treaty hunting boundary cuts across terrain he was planning to develop for a new road route. It cost him money." He paused. "He is also the only council member with established connections to merchants who operate in the Ironville Eastern Range." "You knew," Azra said. "I suspected," he said. "I didn't have evidence. Now I do." The branded exile Hurak was watching Elias with an expression that he now recognized as assessment, the same assessment he had seen on Mora's face and on Azra's senior warriors, the assessment that was asked, "What is this man actually made of?" Hurak had been an exile for 4 years, cast out from the Greyveil Northern clan for refusing to participate in an action he had considered dishonorable, which was apparently the kind of thing that got a man branded rather than acknowledged in the northern clans. He had come south looking for something different and had found it in the Thunderroar camp, and he had spent 6 months watching and learning, and apparently what he had found worth revealing in this moment was something he had been holding until he was sure of the audience. "The Ironville agent in Crestfall," Elias said to Hurak. "Do you have a name?" "A description," Hurak said. "Medium height, northern features, operates from a room above the grain merchant on Market Street." "That's Bain's factor," Elias said. "A man named Corval." Azra was looking at him with a kind of charged attention that had nothing to do with the romance between them and everything to do with what she was seeing. A man who had been quietly paying attention to everything around him for years, and had filed it all in the same precise internal ledger where he kept millstone gaps and seasonal flood levels and the exact angle of every game trail in the valley. "The branded exile who revealed this," Elias said, nodding toward Hurak. "What does your clan law say about someone who delivers a significant intelligence service to the clan?" Mora said from somewhere in the crowd. "It is one of the traditional grounds for restoration." Hurak went very still. "Azra," Elias said. She looked at Hurak for a long moment. Then she said, "The brand marks exile. It does not mark a man's character. What you have given this clan today is worth more than the safety you put at risk by keeping it until you were sure." She paused. "I will advocate to the Northern Clans Tribunal for your restoration. I cannot guarantee the outcome, but I will advocate. Hurek bowed his head in the formal acknowledgement of a serious debt. The confrontation that followed in Crestfall was neither easy nor small. Elias rode south with Azra beside him and two of her senior warriors behind them, and they arrived in Crestfall on a market morning when the square was full of farmers and merchants, and the aldermen were conducting their weekly open session. Elias rode directly to the square and dismounted in the middle of it and said, in a carrying voice that years of projecting instructions over millstone noise had given him, "Alderman Bane, I need to speak with you before the council." The square went quiet. Bane was a stocky, gray-haired man who had the comfortable look of someone who had spent decades being the kind of person other people deferred to, and he came to the council table with the unhurried bearing of someone who did not expect to be the subject of a confrontation. He looked at Azra. He looked at Elias. He looked at the copper ring on Elias' finger with an expression that managed to combine contempt and calculation in equal measure. "The miller has something to say," he said. His tone made the word miller do work. "The miller has evidence to present," Elias said, "concerning a Crestfall-based agent named Corval who has been routing treaty intelligence to the Ironville clan under direction from someone on this council for the past 2 months. The square was very quiet. Bane's expression did not change, which was in itself an answer. "That is a serious accusation," he said. "Yes," Elias said, "I know. Where does it come from? An orc war camp? An exile?" "The word of it comes from 3 independent sources," Elias said, "including a document written in Corval's hand that was found in a location I will present to the council in full session. It comes from the testimony of Hurek, who was present at 2 of the Ironville meetings and can identify every participant. And it comes from Alderman Bane's own financial records, which show payments to a northern merchant house that I believe the council will recognize as a Ironville front operation once they look at them." Bane looked at him for a long moment, and the calculation in his eyes shifted into something colder. "You have been building this case," he said. "I have been watching this valley for 8 years, Elias said. "That is what I do." Behind him, Azra said nothing. She did not need to. Her presence was sufficient, standing in the market square in her warrior's leathers with her arms at her sides, watching Bane with dark gold eyes that held him accountable to every word. Greyveil looked at Elias and then at Bane, and then at the documents Elias had laid on the council table, and his face did the thing a man's face does when he realizes he has been sitting next to a problem for 2 months and missing it. "Bane," he said. The alderman's composure held for exactly 3 more seconds. Then it broke, not dramatically, just a shift in the set of his mouth and eyes, and the calculation was replaced by the particular look of a man who is reevaluating his options and finding them limited. "You cannot prove intent," he said. "I can prove action," Elias said. "The tribunal can assess intent." The council session that followed was the longest open session in Crestfall's recent history. Bane was escorted to the constable's keeping before noon. Corval was found at his room above the grain merchant and confirmed everything, as people who were low-level agents for larger interests generally did when given the alternative of a tribunal versus cooperating. The evidence of the Ironville interference was presented to Alderman Greyveil and the remaining council members in full, and the response from Greyveil was the kind of response Elias had hoped for: immediate and practical, focused on resolution rather than pride. The trading offer to the Ironville clan went out the same afternoon, carried by a rider moving fast toward the east with a letter bearing Greyveil's seal and Azra's mark jointly, offering the Ironville stable grain access and smithwork in exchange for withdrawal and a non-interference agreement. Gorvith's warband was still a week out. They had time. Azra was standing in the market square when the rider left, watching him go, and Elias came to stand beside her, and she glanced down at him with a look that had all the charged complexity she usually held in careful reserve. "Greyveil is treating you differently," she said. "Yes," he said. "He has always known you were intelligent." "He knew I was useful," Elias said. "That is not the same thing," she nodded slowly. "No," she said, "it is not." He looked at her. Are you treating me differently? She thought about it with her usual honesty, the honest pause that he had come to love because it meant that what came after was true. I have always known what you were, she said. I am glad that other people are beginning to. He reached up and touched the copper ring she had worn in her braid, the one now on his finger, and she watched the gesture with the particular softness she only showed in private, and that she was apparently deciding in this moment was acceptable to show here, in the middle of Crestfall's market square, with farmers and merchants and the remaining aldermen all in easy view. Come home, she said. The word home had a new weight when she said it, layered and deliberate. They rode north together in the late afternoon light, and the valley was golden around them and the Greyveil range rose blue and enormous ahead, and she rode beside him rather than ahead of him, which was different, equal, and he felt it. The response from the Ironville came back in 6 days. Gorvith, practical to his core, had accepted the trading terms. The war band turned back. The Greyveil range settled into the particular quality of quiet that follows a crisis that has been resolved before it became a war. Elias was in the camp when the response arrived, at a table with Mora, going over the cartographic corrections to the boundary maps now that Threll's original work was suspect. And Azra came in with the message and read it aloud to the tent, in a voice that was controlled and steady, and allowed nothing of what she felt to show until the warriors had responded and departed, and it was just the two of them. Then she sat down on the low bench and put the message down and looked at her hands for a moment. It is over, she said. Yes, he said. She looked at him. You made this possible. We made this possible, he said. Your intelligence work, your management of the clan, your handling of Threll, your decision to advocate for Hurak, all of that was you. The trading offer to Gorvith was you, she said. It was a millstone gap adjustment, he said. Find the friction point, change the gap. She looked at him for another moment, and then she crossed the tent to where he sat and stood before him and said, in the direct and uncomplicated way she had with everything important, I love you. He had known it was coming, the same way he knew weather was coming, feeling it in the texture of the air before it arrived. He had known for weeks and had been living inside that knowledge with the particular careful joy of a man who had something fragile and precious and was not yet sure how to hold it. I know, he said. I love you. She pulled him to his feet. The rest of that evening was warm and private and belonged entirely to them, to the claiming that had been formal and practical, and was now becoming something else, something built not from necessity and clan politics, but from the slow accumulation of dares and honesty, and shared meals in her hand guiding his through stitches, and his voice telling her about the game trails at dawn. All of it arriving here at the two of them in the fire-lit tent, with the camp quiet outside and nothing held back. She was careful with him. He had not expected that, given everything, the force of her presence, the absolute authority she projected. She was careful in the way of someone who understood that what she was handling mattered. He held her with the same care, his miller's hands which knew how to hold things without crushing them, and they were both fully present and fully certain, and neither of them was afraid. The winter came early to the Greyveil range that year, the first snow arriving in the last week of the harvest month and staying. Elias spent the early cold weeks splitting his time with purpose now, not just out of obligation, but because both halves of his life required him, and he was good at both halves, and the combination had begun to feel like wholeness in a way that nothing before it had. The mill ran. He hired Court permanently for the heavy operations and taught him the millstone adjustment and the seasonal gear maintenance and the current system. And Court learned with the focused enthusiasm of a young man who took seriously the responsibility of being trusted. Elias was there for the critical decisions and the complex repairs and the farmers who needed someone to talk to about credit, and he was in the northern camp for 3 days out of every 7, and Azra arranged her schedule around his the same way he arranged his around hers, without discussion, without negotiation, because it was simply what made sense to both of them. The dares continued, but they had changed. They were less about finding the edges of each other and more about exploring what they had already found. He dared her to teach him the Thunderroar hunting songs, which she did, and he learned them badly, and she corrected him with great patience that was occasionally interrupted by laughter. She dared him to explain to her exactly how the millstone worked from first principles, and he did, and she listened with the same quality of complete attention that she had given him during the negotiations, and she asked 3 questions that were so precisely calibrated to the core mechanical principles that he told her she had missed her calling. "I called myself correctly," she said, not unkindly. "But I am glad someone in the valley knows what they are doing with the grain." Mora caught him alone one evening near the central fire and sat beside him with the comfortable authority of a woman who had been the clan's keeper of records and memory for longer than most of the warriors had been alive. "She is different," Mora said. "Different how?" he said. "Lighter," Mora said. "Not less herself, more herself but with less weight on it." She poked the fire with a long stick. "Since her father died, she has been carrying the clan the way you carry a millstone, necessary but crushing over time." "She doesn't seem crushed," he said. "No," Mora agreed. "She is too strong for that." "But strength is not the same as ease." She looked at him sideways. "You give her ease." He thought about the dark tent and the honest dark and the way she laughed, suddenly and fully, at things that surprised her. "She gives me the same," he said. Mora nodded. "Then you are both lucky," she said, which from her was the equivalent of a formal blessing. He spent the first deep winter snow night in the camp, unable to ride back south in the whiteout, and he and Azra sat by the brazier in her tent, with a map of the valley spread between them, marking things that needed attention in the spring. And the domestic ease of it was the kind of thing he had not let himself want before, because wanting things that were not available was a particular kind of pain. He was aware of that ease, as he would have been aware of the weight of a full millstone that had suddenly been removed. He looked at her across the map, the firelight on her face, her braids undone for sleeping so that her hair fell loose around her shoulders, and she looked up from the map and caught him looking and said nothing for a moment. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I'm just here." She understood that. He could tell by the way her expression settled. "Yes," she said. "You are." Spring came back to the valley with the particular force that follows a hard winter, everything erupting green and wet and loud. The hunting boundary held. The Ironville trade relationship, managed by a newly appointed factor who was not secretly working for anyone's enemies, produced its first successful exchange in the season's 2nd month. Grain from the valley's spring mills, including Crestfalls, going east in exchange for mountain iron ore that the valley's smiths had been short on for 2 years. Drek the smith received his first delivery of quality Ironville ore, and, in the way of practical men who did not confuse their politics with their materials, declared it excellent and said nothing further about the Orc woman's claims on the miller. Bain's tribunal resulted in his removal from the council and a significant fine that was paid into the valley's common fund, which Grieve suggested be used for repair of the eastern road that Bain had been hoping to turn to private profit. There was a particular satisfaction in that outcome that Elias appreciated. Hurak's restoration process was longer and more complicated, as such processes were when they involved multiple clan tribunals and the particular pride of Northern Orc hierarchy. Azra attended the tribunal personally and argued the case with the methodical intelligence she brought to everything, and Elias rode with her to the northern meeting ground and stood at her back as she argued, and Hurak was restored, not to his original position which was gone now, but to the legal status of a free man without the exile mark's consequences. The brand would stay on his arm because it was scar tissue, but its official meaning was formally struck. Hurak looked at Azra after the judgment and said, in the formal acknowledgement of the Thunderroar custom, "The debt stands." "No debt," she said. "You did what was right." Hurak looked at Elias. "She learned that from you," he said. "The other way around," Elias said. Hurak shook his head. "Both," he said. "From each other." He clasped both their wrists in the gesture of respect and walked away, and he looked, for the first time since Elias had been aware of him, like a man walking toward something rather than away from it. The summer brought a season unlike anything the valley had seen in recent memory, warm and generous with rain in the right amounts, and the harvest came in full and early, and the mill ran day and night in the peak weeks with Court and 2 additional seasonal workers managing the day shift, while Elias handled the complex calibrations and accounts. He was spending 4 days at the mill and 3 in the camp now, a rhythm that had settled into the valley's life the way water settled into rock, finding the natural channel and flowing with it. One evening in high summer, Azra rode down to the mill unannounced and arrived at dusk, while Elias was doing the evening gear check, and she walked through the mill with him in a way she had not done before, not as a visitor but as someone who was learning it properly, asking questions about each gear and shaft, and the weight of the millstone and the seasonal adjustments to the wheel paddles. And he answered each question fully, and showed her each mechanism with the care of a teacher who respected his student. And she learned with the focused precision that she brought to everything. When they had completed the full circuit and were standing at the wheel, watching the water move over the paddles in the summer dusk, she said, "I want to understand everything that is yours." "You understand most of it already," he said. "Not this," she said. "I know you, I know how you think. But this is where you came from, this is what shaped your hands." She looked at the wheel. "I want to know what you heard at night growing up, what the wheel sounded like through the walls, what it meant to you before it was a responsibility." He was quiet for a moment. The wheel turned. The water fell. The sound was exactly what it had always been, a constant rhythm at the edge of every thought he had ever had in this place. "It sounded like something that continued," he said. "No matter what else happened. My mother died and the wheel kept turning. My father died and the wheel kept turning. The winters came and went and the wheel kept turning, or we worked until it turned again." He paused. "It used to feel like it was turning without me. Now it feels like it is turning with me." She stood beside him and her hand found his. And they stood like that while the summer evening came down around them and the wheel kept its rhythm. "When I was young," she said, "and my father was still alive, I used to climb to the top of the eastern ridge before dawn and watch the valley come awake. Not our valley, the human valley, this one. From that distance it looked like something that worked." She paused. "I could not imagine being part of something that worked like that, something connected. And now," he said, "now I am part of something that works," she said. She squeezed his hand once, brief and certain. "Come back with me tonight. Mora has been asking when you are going to learn the full harvest blessing custom, and I have been telling her soon for 3 months." He laughed. "All right." He told Court he would be back in 3 days, and rode north with her in the last of the summer light. And the valley spread behind them golden and whole, the mill wheel turning, the river carrying its endless conversation with the limestone shelf, and ahead the Greyveil peaks catching the last sun on their shoulders like something ancient and enduring that was entirely indifferent to the small human drama below, and entirely beautiful because of that indifference. Mora taught him the harvest blessing in full that night, every verse in the Thunderroar tongue, and he repeated each line back in the careful way of someone who wanted to get it right because it mattered. And Mora corrected his pronunciation with the patience of a woman who had long since decided he was worth the effort. And Azra sat across the fire and watched with the expression she saved for things she found privately delightful. When it was late and Mora had gone to her tent, Azra leaned over and said, "Your accent is genuinely terrible." "I know," he said. "I will get better." "You will," she said, with the unqualified certainty that she reserved for things she had decided were true. He looked at her across the fire. The camp was quiet around them. The stars above the Greyveil range were extraordinary, the kind of stars that required serious darkness to see, and they had serious darkness here, 300 feet above the valley floor with no competing light. He had been watching them from the mill his whole life and had never seen them like this, and he understood that was about the altitude and the clear air, but also understood it was about where he was now and who he was sitting next to, and that both of those things were true simultaneously. "Azra," he said. "Yes. I want to tell you something." She waited the way she waited, completely present. "I was alone for a very long time before this," he said. "Not without people. The village was there. Neighbors, farmers, the tavern. I was never physically isolated." He looked at the fire. "I was the kind of alone that other people in a room cannot fix. The kind that is about whether you matter to anyone specifically, whether anyone would notice if you were a different person or not there at all." She said nothing, and he continued. "I have not been that kind of alone since you guided my hands through those stitches," he said. "Since the first night in the surgical tent. I did not understand that yet at the time. I understand it now." The fire crackled. She looked at him with the dark gold eyes that had seen through every layer of him since the beginning and found something worth keeping there. "I noticed you before the stitches," she said. "I know, the first day of negotiations. I watched you throughout all 6 days," she said. "You were the only person in that tent who was not performing. The aldermen were performing confidence they did not feel. My warriors were performing ferocity to keep the humans cautious. You were just there, listening, paying attention, filing things away." She paused. "I thought, that man sees everything and says nothing about it. I wanted to know what he saw." "And now you know," he said. "I keep finding more," she said. "I expect I will keep finding more for a very long time." "Is that all right?" he said. "It is," she said. "The thing I wanted most and did not know how to want." He moved around the fire to where she sat and settled beside her, and she turned toward him. And the night was warm and enormous around them, and the stars burned clean above the peaks. And she put her forehead against his in the gesture he had come to understand was the closest thing her custom had to saying something too important for words. They stayed like that for a long time. The autumn brought the second harvest cycle, and with it, the full weight of what the trading agreement had produced. The valley's output was 30% higher than the previous year, partly because the absence of conflict meant that farmers had planted the full extent of their lands rather than hedging against potential loss, and partly because the Ironville iron had allowed Dreck's smithy to repair farm equipment that had been deteriorating for years. Elias logged the numbers in the mill's accounts and felt, for the first time in 4 years, that the mill was not just surviving but genuinely thriving. He brought the accounts to Azra one evening and showed her the numbers, and she went through them with the methodical precision of a clan leader who understood resource management, and she looked up at him with something that was pride, not in the numbers exactly but in what the numbers represented. "This is what the boundary agreement bought," she said. "This is what the boundary agreement bought," he agreed. "When the council reconvenes," she said, "Greyveil will want to extend the trading arrangement." "He is already drafting the proposal," Elias said. "He asked me to review the mill's capacity numbers for the extended output projections." "He asks you now," she said. "Not the council members, you." "I'm still just the miller," he said. "You are," she agreed, "the most important person in this valley's economic stability." She said it without flattery, as simple fact. "You always were. People are beginning to see it." He thought about that, about being seen, about the specific quality of being seen by the right eyes in the right way at the right moment. He thought about how long he had worked and kept his head down and done good work without any particular expectation that it would be recognized, and how the recognition, now that it was arriving from multiple directions, felt less like validation and more like evidence that the world could be fair when sufficient effort was applied to it. "Come with me tomorrow," he said. "I want to show you something." She came. He took her on foot down the east bank of the Crest River to the place where the water narrowed above the mill, and he showed her the exact shelf of limestone that he had been planning for 2 years to modify slightly to improve the water flow to the wheel during the low-flow months of late summer. He had sketched it and resketched it, and had the calculation right in his head, but had never had anyone to show it to. No one who would understand both the mechanical principle and the physical geography. She stood on the limestone shelf and looked at the water, and he walked her through the plan, and she crouched down and ran her fingers along the rock where the cut would need to be made and asked 2 questions that showed she had followed exactly what he said. And then she said, "You will need to brace the cut from the upstream side, or you will lose the anchor point when the spring floods come." He had not thought of that. He stood looking at the rock for a moment and then said, "You're right. I usually am," she said mildly. He looked at her crouched on the wet limestone in her warrior's leathers, her braids falling forward, her strong hands on the rock, entirely at ease in the geography of his work, and the feeling that moved through him was so large and settled and warm that it had no particular edge to it. It was just there, complete. "Azra," he said. She looked up. "I would like to build something here," he said. "Not just the limestone cut, a place, something permanent between the mill and the camp, something that is both." She stood up slowly. "You are asking if I would consider living between 2 worlds," she said. "I am asking if you would consider building a third one," he said. "Something new, ours." She looked at the river and the mill downstream and the northern trail that led up into the valley toward the Thunderroar camp, and she was quiet in the way she was quiet when something mattered enough to be thought about carefully. "The clan needs me in the camp for most functions," she said. "I cannot leave that. I know. But a war matron who maintains a formal presence in both settlements is more effective than one who is only visible in one," she said. "There is political value in it." "There is," he agreed, "and I did not argue it as political value. I argued it as what I want." "I know," she said. "I was providing the political justification for doing what I also want." He smiled at that. She saw it, and the fierce, brief smile came back, and then she crossed the wet limestone to where he was standing and took hold of the front of his shirt with both hands, not pulling, just holding, and looked at him. "Yes," she said, "we build a third one." He kissed her on the limestone shelf above the mill with the river below them, and the valley open around them, and the Greyveil range watching from the north. And it was, he thought, the least private kiss they had ever shared, entirely visible to anyone who happened to be on the river path, which at that time of the morning meant 2 farmers and a boy who was fishing from the opposite bank, and who would undoubtedly report what he had seen to the village tavern by nightfall. He found he did not mind that at all. The building started in the late autumn, in the wedge of flat land between the mill and the northern trail, a stone structure that borrowed its plan from neither Crestfall's buildings nor the Thunderroar tents, but from what made sense for the terrain and the purpose. Hurak, who had been spending increasing time in the valley area as his relationship with the Thunderroar camp deepened into a genuine belonging, turned out to have a talent for stonework that he had apparently been deploying quietly in the camp's construction projects for months. He came to help with the foundation and stayed through the walls, and Elias found him an invaluable partner for the structural work. And Azra arrived most evenings in the final weeks and contributed her assessment of every beam placement and wall angle with the spatial intelligence that had made her an effective tactical commander. The structure was finished in the last warm days before the deep winter, square and solid, with a hearth at each end, and walls thick enough to hold heat through the Greyveil cold. It was neither large nor small. It was exactly sufficient, which was the quality that Elias had always aimed for in everything he built. Mora came down from the camp the day they moved the first fire into the hearth and sat by it for a long time and said nothing, and when Elias looked at her, she was doing something with her expression that he had not seen before and that he understood was the equivalent of weeping for a woman who did not weep. "What?" he said. "She used to sit on the eastern ridge and watch this valley," Mora said. "When she was young, she watched it like someone who was certain she would never be part of it." "I know," he said. "She told me." Mora looked at him. "You gave her the valley," she said. "The valley was always available," he said. "It just needed a door." Mora put her hand briefly on his arm, and it was exactly the kind of gesture that contained everything she did not say, and he was glad of it. Azra came in from the camp trail that evening as the sun went down behind the peaks, and she stopped in the doorway of the new building and looked at him where he was building up the fire, and he looked back at her. She crossed the floor. She sat beside him on the stone hearthstone and looked at the fire for a while, and then she leaned her shoulder into his and he leaned back, and the fire caught and the room was warm, and outside the first stars of the early winter night were appearing above the Greyveil range, the same stars he had watched from the mill all his life, the same ones he had watched with her from the mountain camp. "How does it feel?" he asked. She thought about it with her usual care. "Like staying," she said. He understood exactly what she meant. He had been staying at the mill his whole life, and staying had felt like remaining when other things left, like being the fixed point that absorbed departure. It had felt sometimes like being the wheel, necessary, continuous, alone in its rotation. This was different. This was staying as choosing, as arriving over and over in the same place because the place contained something worth returning to. Her hand found his. He felt the calluses of her spear grip against his own mill-roughened palm, two people built by their work, fitting together with the naturalness of things that have been shaped by the same forces and come to rest against each other. The fire crackled. The wheel kept turning on the river outside. The valley held them both in its cold autumn silence, and it was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a place where something has settled, finally and permanently, into its right shape. He was no longer the miller who kept the wheel turning alone in the gray weather. He was the man Azra Thunderroar had ridden south to see on the 10th day, and guided through stitches, and claimed in front of her entire clan, and built a door into her valley for, and chosen with the full deliberate intelligence she brought to everything she decided, again and again and again. She chose him. She was still choosing him now. And he sat beside her in the warm room they had built between two worlds and felt, in the most complete and undeniable way available to a person who had spent years uncertain of it, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, with exactly the person he was supposed to be with, and that this, right here in the firelight, leaning into each other while the stars came out above the Greyveil range, was what the end of being alone felt like. Not the absence of solitude, the presence of her. The wheel kept turning. The river kept talking to the stone, and neither of them moved because there was nowhere else either of them needed to be.